Welcome to the final part of our heritage talk on uncovering Park Street.
Um, so, um, Anatomical dissections. Now, these are a bit similar to autopsies in that you often get cuts in the cranium and in the front of the chest. However, the way we can distinguish these from autopsies are that we often get numerous other cuts and in many other different parts of the body. And the reason for this is that um, these were bodies that were supplied to medical schools to train doctors. And this was an essential part of the training of any doctor and an important part of a course. So medical schools really had to put on an anatomy class. And there were a certain number of students and a certain number of bodies, and they had to divide up the bodies to groups of students so that they could study them. And often this meant dividing up, taking one leg off or another leg off or an arm off and giving it to a set of students and asking them to dissect it and to investigate the muscles, etc. And this is why we get numerous cuts on some of these dissections. Um, Basically, as part of the medical teaching, you have to know about the structure and the anatomy of a body. And the dissection really is the best way of informing you of the structure and function of the muscles and the joints and the organs of the body. And actually, some of the techniques of dissection and of anatomical study are quite old. We found, for example, a cranial bisection, which is a cut in the skull, which allows you to inspect the anatomy of the cranium. And this particular cut is illustrated actually by Leonardo da Vinci back in the 15th century. So some of these techniques were centuries old. And it wasn't just the study of anatomy that these bodies were used for. Another thing that they were commonly used for was actually for the practice of surgery. If you're a trainee doctor, it's handy to be able to practice your skill on someone who is dead rather than someone who's living. For example, limb amputations. If you want to carry out a limb amputation, far better to do that do such a risky operation first on the body of a dead person before moving on to someone who is alive. Now, once the medical school had finished with the anatomical dissection of an individual, they were supposed to put the different parts of the individual back together and send them for burial. And we find some examples of this at Park Street, where the individual has been put back in anatomical position, with only the cut marks portraying the fact that they have been dissected before burial. However, we also find instances where there may be, say, one arm missing or leg missing. They haven't quite got all the body back together. And in some cases, we've actually got quite mixed up individuals where body portions have been put back in more random fashion. And sometimes there's perhaps more than one individual mixed up together in the same burial. And it's important to remember that we see the skeletal evidence, but actually many of these body portions would have gone back into the coffin fleshed, or at least partially fleshed. And they were put in coffins and buried at Park Street. For all intents and purposes, they were given a normal burial in a normal coffin in the normal area at Park Street. They happened to be in the poorer north area of the ground. So that's particularly interesting because in previous excavations where we've encountered dissected individuals, it's always been in hospital burial grounds. It'd be very unusual to find them in a parish ground. And you do have to wonder whether this kind of activity was officially sanctioned or not. Now, if we go to another example of dissection, we can look at this one. This is a particularly interesting example that we found back in the winter of 2017 during the evaluation, the initial phases of investigation at Park Street, where we dug a few test pits just to see what the ground conditions were like and to see what kind of level of preservation we had in the burials. And in one of the trenches, we found this real surprise. It was an adult male individual, and I don't know whether you can see or not, but both of the hands had been sawn off, presumably to be used by students to look at the structure and anatomy of the muscles and the joints of the hand. In addition, the left foot has also been sawn off, probably for the same reason. They left the right foot there for some reason, so they obviously didn't need that. Now, perhaps the most interesting thing about this skeleton is that they had laid the body onto its front, and then starting either side of the neck, they had sawn down the sides of the vertebrae through the ribs, down through the pelvis, and this allowed them to remove the spinal column. And presumably this was for basically to create a model of a spine for anatomical display and anatomical teaching. You sometimes see spines hanging up, plastic spines hanging up in orthopedic wards, and people who basically treat back injuries, for example, they might have a plastic spine up with all the vertebrae hanging from a pole, and this seems to be the same idea, although I've never seen it before in archaeological remains. So this is a really interesting case, and what made it a bit more interesting in archaeological terms was that we didn't recover the head or some of the top part of the skeleton, so the right scapula and the clavicles. We didn't get those either. That's because we were only digging a small trench, and the top part of this skeleton actually went beyond our limits of excavation. So I had to wait a year to go back to site when we had the main excavation, the open excavation, and hunt down the rest of this individual. And you can see in the picture that we did find both clavicles, we found the right scapula, and we found the skull. And I was on particular lookout for the skull because I was interested to see whether they'd removed the skull with the vertebral column, but obviously they hadn't. They'd dissected the neck vertebrae away from the skull and left the skull in situ, removed the spine. I assume they packed the body cavity perhaps with some organic material to keep everything in place, and then put it in the coffin and buried the individual. So this is a particularly interesting example, and I'm just going to show you one more example in the next slide. And this is of a dissection where again, an adult male, and what they've done is in a way they've disjointed this individual. They've removed the arms at the shoulder joints, and they've removed the legs at the hip joints. They have actually replaced the arms and the legs, but not in an anatomical position. You can see them below the pelvis towards the bottom of the slide. So that's interesting in itself, but what's also interesting in this individual is that we've got a rare example of a dissection tool left in situ in the left shoulder joint of this individual. And this looks like a metal probe, would probably have been used to reflect the muscles and the tendons around the shoulder joint during the dissection. And it seems to have broken into two pieces, and perhaps this is why they left the tool there rather than recovering it before the burial. And we know that the students in Birmingham normally had to buy their own instruments, and this particular one may well have come from Salt and Sons on Corporation Street, which is still in business today. Now, the story of these dissections can really be traced back to the advances in medical science in the 18th and 19th centuries. and in particular in this case to the rise of the medical schools in the first half of the 19th century. There was money to be made in this practice. Doctors needed to be trained, and you could charge high fees for recruiting them and teaching them and giving them a medical course, and then they could go on to earn their living being doctors. And as I said before, part of this training, this essential training, was looking at the anatomy, and this normally involved dissection of human cadavers. The only problem was, as Emma's already said, was that there was a shortage of bodies with which to do this. And that's because the only people who could legally be dissected were those who had been convicted of murder and sentenced to death and dissection. This meant that there were an awful lot of anatomy schools, medical schools, looking for corpses, but a very, very small supply. And this, of course, led to the rise of the gangs of the body snatchers or resurrectionists, who, of course, caused public disgust. If you can imagine going to bury your loved one, and you can imagine that you really weren't sure whether a couple of days later or the night after someone would come along and dig up your relative, take them to a medical school where they'd be laid out on a table and then cut into pieces. So people had a genuine fear, a realistic fear of being dissected, of being taken from their graves and dissected. So the government eventually had to act, and they decided that what they would do was try and increase the supply of bodies for anatomical study, and they hoped that would put off the body snatchers. The way they did this was to pass the Anatomy Act of 1832, which sanctioned the dissection of individuals who were unclaimed at death. So these would be people such as vagrants, the poverty-stricken, those without families, or those who came from families who were too poor to afford to pay for a funeral and relied on the state. And there's a real fear. People knew that their relatives might be dissected. So what they tended to do was to get together in what they call burial clubs and put their money together, and then if one of your relatives died, you could use that burial club, the money from that burial club, to pay for your relative's burial. So people had a real fear, and basically, because in effect the Anatomy Act sanctioned the dissection of the poor, this meant that many of the people came from the poor institutions, people who couldn't afford burial, people who were unclaimed. So we're talking about workhouses, prisons, and some hospitals. And in all this, of course, we want to find out what happened specifically at Park Street, because we don't know exactly where these burials came from, but we suspect it was from the Birmingham Medical School, as Emma's already said, opened by William Sands Cox in 1825. Cox originally came from Birmingham, but he trained in London. He didn't like his training in London. He said that the London medical schools were unchristian in their practices. So he returned to Birmingham to set up his own. And this worked fairly well because, again, as Emma said, they kept having to move to larger premises to expand for the number of students that they were taking in to study anatomy. And there's no doubt that in the course of the 19th century, this taught a vast number of doctors about anatomy, improved their skills, and contributed to medical science. But unfortunately, of course, it came at a cost to the poor. And really, it's just a reflection of the conditions at the time, where the state was taking more and more power away from the poor and the vulnerable. But we're going to do more work on these dissections at the analysis phase of the investigation, and we hope to come up with a lot more evidence and a lot more interesting stories about these people in Birmingham, because we don't know their names, but we're hoping that this work, particularly with the dissected, the poorer individuals, will help us to be able to tell some of their story.
Thank you for watching our Heritage Talk on uncovering Park Street. Keep an eye out for future Heritage Talks across our social media channels.